He had already been offered a way out. His president, the man he had sworn to protect, personally urged him to abandon the mountain pass and save himself while there was still time. 24-year-old General Gregorio del Pilar looked at the man he'd followed through years of revolution and war and said the words that would define the rest of his short life. "It is better for me to be here, because then the enemy will only reach the top of this mountain when every one of us is already dead." 60 men stood behind him on that ridge. 300 American soldiers were climbing toward them from below. And in less than an hour, almost none of those 60 men would still be breathing. By late November 1899, the Philippine Revolutionary Army had effectively collapsed as a conventional fighting force. President Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the fight for Filipino independence, had disbanded his regular army into scattered guerrilla units and was now fleeing north through brutal mountain terrain, one step ahead of an advancing American force determined to capture him and end the war in a single decisive stroke. If Aguinaldo was captured, the revolution itself could effectively die with him. Everything now depended on buying enough time for the president to disappear into terrain the Americans didn't know as well as the Filipinos did, and someone had to be the reason that time existed. That someone was General Gregorio del Pilar, one of the youngest generals in the entire Revolutionary Army, a man who had already built a reputation for fearless, aggressive leadership in earlier battles against both Spanish and American forces. As Aguinaldo's party reached a narrow, treacherous mountain bottleneck called Tirad Pass on November 23rd, Del Pilar recognized immediately what the terrain offered: a natural choke point, high ground, a position where a small, determined force might hold off a much larger one for critical hours or even days if defended correctly. He volunteered to command the rear guard. He knew exactly what that assignment likely meant for the men who accepted it. Del Pilar selected 60 men from his Bulacan battalion to hold the pass, soldiers who understood, at least in general terms, the severity of what they were being asked to do: delay an American advance long enough for their president and the wider revolutionary cause to survive, using little more than rifles, elevation, and raw determination against a force that would eventually outnumber them by a margin of 5-1 or worse. They dug into positions along the ridge overlooking the narrow mountain trail below, the only realistic approach route American forces could use to push through the pass. It was, by every conventional military calculation, a position that could delay an enemy advance. It was not a position 60 men could realistically hold forever. On the morning of December 2nd, 1899, Major Peyton C. March led somewhere between 300 and 500 American soldiers, primarily from the 33rd Volunteer Infantry Regiment, toward the base of Tirad Pass, beginning what should have been, on paper, a straightforward assault against a badly outnumbered defensive position. From their elevated position along the ridge, Del Pilar's 60 men watched the American advance begin below them, rifles ready, the entire weight of their president's survival resting on how long they could hold this single, narrow stretch of mountain trail against soldiers climbing steadily closer with every passing minute. The battle opened with Del Pilar's men pouring rifle fire down onto the advancing Americans from their commanding position above, the elevation advantage proving devastatingly effective in the opening exchanges of the fight. American soldiers, forced to advance up an exposed, narrow trail with almost no cover available, took the brunt of the initial defense. casualties mounting as Filipino riflemen picked off targets from a position the Americans struggled to effectively return fire against. For a brief, critical stretch of that morning, 60 men were doing exactly what they'd been asked to do, making a vastly larger force pay dearly for every single meter of ground gained toward the pass above them. But the terrain that gave Del Pilar's men their advantage also concealed a fatal vulnerability that neither side had fully mapped in advance. Somewhere in the surrounding mountains, an alternate route existed, a path that could allow attacking soldiers to bypass the frontal defense entirely and strike the Filipino position from an unprotected flank or from behind. Accounts differ on exactly how this route was discovered, with some describing a local guide leading American soldiers around the Filipino position, but the outcome remained devastatingly consistent regardless of the exact details. The natural fortress Del Pilar had chosen to defend was about to be outflanked in a way 60 men spread thin along a single ridge had no realistic way to prevent. As American soldiers began appearing from an unexpected direction, catching Filipino defenders in a crossfire between the frontal assault below and this newly opened flank, the entire tactical picture of the battle collapsed within minutes. Soldiers who had been concentrating fire on a single approach route now found themselves fighting on two fronts simultaneously with a force a fraction of the size needed to hold either position effectively, let alone both. Del Pilar, directing his men from an exposed position along the ridge, understood immediately what this development meant for the battle and for the 60 men who had trusted him enough to stand on this mountain in the first place. Despite the collapsing tactical situation, Del Pilar refused to fall back, continuing to direct his men's defense from a position that offered him almost no cover from the American forces now pressing in from multiple directions at once. He had been given the option to leave before the battle even began. He had been given further opportunities to retreat as the fighting intensified. Every single time, he chose to remain with his men on that exposed ridge, understanding with complete clarity that his continued presence directing their defense was itself buying additional minutes his president needed to disappear deeper into the mountains beyond. It was in this final desperate phase of the battle, outflanked, outnumbered, fighting on two fronts with an already thin defensive line stretched past its breaking point, that an American sharpshooter spotted General Gregorio del Pilar directing his troops from the exposed ridge and fired the shot that would end his life. He fell on the mountain he had chosen to defend, 24 years old, having explicitly refused every chance to save himself in the final moments of a battle that history would remember as the Philippine Thermopylae, a name borrowed from an ancient Greek last stand, because what happened on this Filipino mountainside in December 1899 belonged in exactly that same brutal, sacrificial tradition. With their commander dead and the battle now lost on every practical level, the surviving remnants of Del Pilar's 60-man rear guard could not hold the pass any longer. Of the 60 men who had taken up positions on that ridge that morning, 52 were killed in the fighting, a catastrophic casualty rate that left almost nothing resembling an organized fighting force by the time American soldiers finally secured the pass. American losses, by contrast, were remarkably light for the scale of what had been attempted. Accounts place them at only 3 killed and 9 wounded, a stark, brutal illustration of exactly how one-sided the final phase of the battle had ultimately become once the flanking maneuver succeeded. But the battle's true purpose had never actually been to win, and by that measure it succeeded completely. Every hour, every minute that Del Pilar's men held the Americans at Tirad Pass was time President Aguinaldo used to continue his escape deeper into the mountainous interior of northern Luzon, evading capture and keeping the revolutionary cause alive well beyond what would have been possible without a rear guard willing to trade their own survival for his. 60 men and one 24-year-old general who had every opportunity to walk away chose instead to make sure their president lived to fight another day, even knowing with near total certainty exactly what that choice would cost most of them personally. What happened to Del Pilar's body in the immediate aftermath of the battle remains one of the more haunting details of this entire story. His corpse lay unburied on the mountainside for 3 days, stripped of his military decorations, his uniform, and his personal belongings by the victorious American forces who had defeated him. It was an American officer, Lieutenant Dennis Quinlan, who eventually organized a proper burial for the fallen Filipino general, working alongside local Igorot residents of the region to give him a resting place and a marker, a small, unexpected act of respect from the very army that had just killed him. The plaque Quinlan left at Del Pilar's grave read simply, "General Gregorio del Pilar, died December 2nd, 1989, commanding Aguinaldo's rear guard, an officer and a gentleman." It was a remarkable epitaph to receive from the opposing side of a war, a small but genuine acknowledgement from American forces that what they had witnessed on that mountainside deserved to be remembered as something more than simply another battlefield casualty. A war correspondent present in the aftermath, Richard Henry Little, wrote his own tribute that would echo through Philippine history for generations afterward, that no line had been carved, no stone had been raised, but Del Pilar had been left alone with his glory all the same. Del Pilar's own diary, recovered among his looted belongings, contained a final entry written the night before the battle. Words that, across more than a century since, still carry the weight of a young man who understood exactly what the following morning likely held for him. Different historical sources record slightly different exact wording for that final entry, but the essential sentiment survives intact across every version. A soldier, hours from what he almost certainly suspected would be his final battle, choosing to record his thoughts anyway, understanding that whatever happened next was now beyond anything he could personally control. It's worth being honest about the harder edges of this story too, because that honesty is part of what makes Del Pilar's sacrifice so genuinely remarkable, rather than simply mythologized. Some historians have described Tirad Pass as a battle that, in purely strategic terms, only allowed Aguinaldo to continue running rather than achieving any permanent safety. The revolutionary leader would eventually be captured roughly 18 months later regardless. But that critique, however factually grounded, doesn't diminish what 60 men accomplished on that mountainside in the moment their sacrifice actually mattered. Buying a leader 18 more months of freedom and continued resistance is not a small thing, regardless of how the wider war eventually concluded. In the decades that followed, Gregorio del Pilar's stand at Tirad Pass became one of the most enduring symbols of sacrifice in Philippine military history and national memory, cited repeatedly as an example of complete, selfless devotion to a cause larger than individual survival. The Philippine Military Academy itself was eventually named Fort Pilar in his honor, ensuring that generations of future Filipino military officers would train and study under the name of a 24-year-old general who had chosen certain death over the safety he'd been explicitly offered, because he believed his president's survival mattered more than his own. Even during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines decades later, Del Pilar's sacrifice at Tirad Pass was deliberately revived and commemorated by the Japanese-backed wartime government, which created a specific Tirad Pass medal intended to rekindle anti-American sentiment by reminding the Filipino population of this earlier conflict against American forces. It's a strange, complicated footnote to an already complicated story. A young general's genuine sacrifice for Filipino independence, later repurposed as wartime propaganda by an entirely different occupying power decades after his death, for reasons that had nothing to do with his own original motivations on that mountainside. President Manuel Quezon himself, reflecting on Del Pilar's sacrifice years later, asked a question that has echoed through Philippine historical memory ever since. Who among the nation's martyred dead, or among the living, could truly match the loyalty and gallantry Gregorio del Pilar displayed at Tirad Pass, offering his own life without hesitation in service of a duty he considered more important than his own survival? It's the kind of question that doesn't have a comfortable answer, precisely because so few people in any nation's history actually get tested against a choice that stark. Walk away and live, or stay and almost certainly die, with absolutely no ambiguity about which outcome was more likely. 60 men held a mountain pass against overwhelming numbers so that one man could keep running, keep fighting, keep a revolution alive a little longer. 52 of them died doing it, including the 24-year-old general who had every opportunity in the world to walk away and chose instead to stand with his soldiers until an American bullet ended his life on a ridge in Ilocos Sur. More than a century later, Gregorio del Pilar's name still carries the weight of that single choice. Not victory, not survival, but a willingness to trade everything he had left for a cause and a president he believed was worth more than his own life.